Hi, thanks for joining us. Myself, Steve Hayes, and Michael Darby from Element as we go through some tea time top tips on all that's happening in the regulatory world for connected technology. So this video now is just an introduction to some of the activities and industry events that Michael and I have been attending in recent weeks and months. And really, they comprise predominantly of two major events. There is the TCB Council, which happens in the USA twice a year. So Michael is going to give us an update on what happened in the spring meeting. And then the European equivalent of that, which is called the REDCA, or Radio Equipment Directive Compliance Association for its full title, which concluded just a week or so ago over in Ireland in Europe. So, Michael, can you just give us a very brief overview on the TCB Council? I know that you're going to do a more comprehensive deep dive into some of the more technical details of TCB Council, but what are the headline acts?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I'll separate out all the details into a different video, but just to give you an overview of some of the key topics. So you probably know you've got the FCC rules pretty much set in stone. It could change at a glacial rate, and then you get the standards, and then if the FCC want to update their guidance or give any instructions on how they want things done, they publish these documents known as KDBs, which stands for a knowledge database. So every 6 months when we have the TCB workshop, they update a lot of those KDB documents. So I'll talk about all of those. You know, some of the hot ones are radio modules and radio module installations, things like labeling, wireless power transfer or wireless power charging. But also one of the topics the FCC talked a lot about and has really updated their guidance on is the 6 and 7 gigahertz Wi-Fi devices. So they rolled these out, Wi-Fi 6E, you might know the term. They've rolled these out with sort of very low power, indoor only type of devices, and they continue to evolve their rules to allow different types of device. So there was a lot of talk about that. Another KDB or guidance document is all about RF exposure. The FCC rules on RF exposure changed about 3 years ago, and the FCC are still working on their guidance for that topic. It's a work in progress, but you've got to think that their network of KDB documents is like a spider's web, and if they change one, it has consequences elsewhere. You ping it in one place, and if you understand the FCC authorization process, you'll know that you need to follow procedures. And if there's any break in the procedural process, then it leaves people a bit legally stuck. So they need to make sure that they've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's, if you like. There was talk about the new FCC's proposed cybersecurity labelling scheme. This will be a voluntary scheme. It will be part of the FCC rules, but kind of decoupled from the equipment authorization thing. So you won't necessarily have to do it at the same time. In fact, there was a big cybersecurity panel session at the TCB Council workshop. I was a part of that. I was representing the Radio Equipment Directive notified body community and also the sort of UK approved bodies looking at the UK's PSTI. Industry Canada, or ICED Canada as they're now known, they were there giving us a lot of updates. One of the important topics for them, in addition also to their Wi-Fi 6E updates, they've released a new guidance document on RF exposure. As I hope you understand, from a compliance point of view, Canada sits somewhere in the mid-Atlantic really. It has certification like the USA, but it has selling your product to the latest published standard, just like we have in Europe. And so when they issue a new standard, you've got to keep up to date with that. So there's a new RF exposure guidance issued in December. You've got 1 year to update all your product approvals or authorizations to meet that. So those were the key topics really, Steve. After that, there was some industry updates. I spoke about things happening in Europe. There were input on 5G and 6G technology, Wi-Fi 7 protocol, Wi-Fi 8 protocol, and a lot of global market access stuff. So all in all, a good week, really.
Great stuff. Okay, and then just to recap, we're going to do another video more in depth. You're going to talk about that in some detail in a separate video. And then we move on to RED-CA. So RED-CA, as I said before, is the European equivalent of TCB Council. That was in May of 2024, the latest meeting over in Dublin. Much enjoyment, much Guinness, drunk by the whole of the industry, so that was fantastic. And then in terms of topics of discussion, again, what we'll do is we'll do a more in-depth video on summarising the RED-CA. But in terms of the topics that we talked about, really quite a varied range of topics themselves. Things like delisting of harmonised standards. I don't want to go into the detail of that now, but historically, standards would stay on the official journal of the European Union for really quite a long period of time. But there's a change within the Commission in terms of getting rid of standards sooner rather than later, for where either they don't represent state of the art, or they conflict, or are not written in a technology neutral way, and therefore sort of slow progress down in other areas of innovation. So that was one thing. Restrictions, while we're talking about harmonised standards, there are, again, the official journal has a notes section, and in the notes section there are some standards which are listed there, i.e. they provide a presumption of conformity to the directive, but there's some caveats or restrictions associated with that. Predominantly they related to measurement uncertainty and tolerances in some instances. And actually the European Commission has revised their understanding of that particular issue, and many of those restrictions will be removed. So we'll talk about that in more detail as well. Another one was cyber.
Yeah, again, cybersecurity, a hot topic at the moment. And so we reviewed the situation with the Radio Equipment Directive cybersecurity requirements, which will come in on the 1st of August 2025. And we asked the European Commission any plans to delay it further, and they clearly said no. So there is no plans to delay it any further. The standards group, CENELEC, which are writing the cybersecurity standards for the Radio Equipment Directive, this is the EN 18031 series of standards. There's two working groups. There's a working group for the Radio Equipment Directive standards, and then a working group for the Cyber Resilience Act standards. And they're working together such that the standards will look very similar. So there should be a nice smooth transition rather than a big jump. And on previous Element webinars, I've talked about the fact that we'll have the cybersecurity requirements for the RED come in for maybe 2 years, and then it will be repealed and replaced by the Cyber Resilience Act, which kind of seems strange. But one thing that got discussed was the fact that the Cyber Resilience Act might not cover all types of radio equipment. And so rather than repealing the RED cyber part, they might modify it instead. So that's all interesting stuff. We'll go over to that in a bit more detail on another video.
Great stuff. Other topics of discussion were about the guides associated with radio equipment, or the Radio Equipment Directive.
It's not Girl Guides, right?
Yes, not the Girl Guide guides. So we have one for the RED itself, and that is in the process of being updated. ADCO, which is the police, if you like, for the directive, take the responsibility of preparing the guide itself. And then there's also a delegated act that supports Article 3.4 of the directive, which is on common charges. And the Commission has recently published the guide specifically on that topic. So we talked about that, and again, we'll talk about that in more detail shortly. In terms of the directive and legal requirements, there was an interesting development a little while ago now. I don't want to go into the detail now, other than to say it's likely that standards which are published in the official journal of the European Union for each of the different CE marking directives, the European Standards Organisation, the ESOs, will have to make those free of issue to anybody that needs them to support their claims of compliance to the directive. So we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. As well as some guidance, if you like, or some advice to us as notified bodies when we issue what are called type examination certificates, and making sure that we don't issue documents or certificates that could be confused with type examination certificates. That is a very specific type of document, a type examination certificate, and there's a hint that some notified bodies, not necessarily for radio equipment, but other notified bodies for other directives or regulations, are producing documents that could be confused with that. So we were given some guidance to step away from issuing those sorts of things.
You might have seen similar things. You might have seen cases where if you go to a test lab, the test lab must do some testing and give you the results and say, here's the limit it passed, or here's the standard, it passed this standard. And you'll sometimes see a test lab try and issue a kind of certificate of conformance to a directive based on the testing they've done. These certificates are not good things, and the industry acknowledges that they're bad news and very confusing, because they can give the manufacturer some sort of false belief that they meet the directive when actually all they've done is pass some tests. And there's a lot more involved in meeting the directive. But the European Commission doesn't really have any control over the labs around the world that might issue such a certificate. But they found, some notified bodies issuing certificates, almost like saying, here's a certificate from me. I'm a notified body, but I'm not issuing this as a notified body. And the Commission is saying, don't do that. That's not good. That's confusing.
Great stuff.
And another interesting thing from Europe, the European Commission, so for years now, people have said to me, can I find a database of all the certificates that notified bodies have ever issued? And I say, no, a notified body certificate is a private document between the notified body and the manufacturer. Or they'll say, is there a list of manufacturers' declaration of conformities? And you say, no, they're supplied with the product. Well, the European Commission is now realizing that it has no data or no knowledge of what radio products exist on the market in Europe, what types of product are being sold, where they're coming from in the world, who's making them, who's testing them. And the European Commission would like to have that data. We see a lot from the USA, in fact, about where it's controlling where equipment comes from and where it's going to go. And so the European Commission is really doing some research at the moment on how it could gather data. For example, it could mandate that all notified bodies upload their certificates to a database. That would track products that have a certificate, but it wouldn't track all products. So another option might be for manufacturers to register their product by uploading a declaration of conformity. It's all a work in progress at the moment, but interesting stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Last couple of things, I guess, things like reconfigurable radio systems, refurbished products. They're all topics of discussion at REDCA as well. So be sure to check out those videos. They'll be uploaded separately. I hope you'll find them useful. This was just intended really as a very high-level summary of the sorts of conversations that have been going on in recent months. But if any of those take your interest or fancy, then feel free and check out the other videos where we go into more depth about these things. Cool. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks.